The night was heavy with tension as the soldiers surrounded the small cottage at the edge of the quiet town. A woman stood in the middle of the room, her wrists bound by rough rope, her face pale but her eyes burning with quiet strength. She was simple in appearance, no military badges, no weapons, just a plain dress and the trembling air of someone caught in a storm she hadn't started. The soldiers laughed at her stillness, mocking her silence, calling her weak. One of them sneered, tugging at the rope, "What now? Superman gonna fly in and save you?" They didn't realize the irony of their words. The woman didn't answer. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. Instead, she lowered her gaze, whispering a silent prayer, not for her life, but for theirs. Because she knew something they did not, her husband was coming. And when he came, the storm would no longer be on her. It would be on them. Her husband was not just a man. He was a warrior forged through fire, a commander in the Navy SEALs, a man whose name carried weight in places most of these soldiers had only heard of in fearful whispers. He was the kind of man whose presence turned chaos into silence, whose training made fear itself hesitate. And tonight, he was not late. The soldiers laughed louder, circling her, tossing crude jokes into the night. But suddenly, the air shifted. A sound, barely audible at first, cut through their laughter. A soft crunch of boots on gravel. Then silence. The kind of silence that made even the bravest heart stumble. The leader of the soldiers barked an order, but his voice wavered. A shadow filled the doorway. Broad shoulders, calm posture, a face hardened by battles seen and survived. He wasn't in a polished uniform, just rugged gear, dust on his boots, and eyes sharp as steel. Those who mocked at Superman saving her now found themselves frozen by the reality of a man more dangerous than fiction. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply walked in, his presence enough to make the soldiers tighten their grip on their weapons. His voice was quiet, almost too calm. "Let her go." One soldier snickered nervously, trying to mask his fear. "And who are you supposed to be?" The man stepped closer, and in the dim light, the patches and scars across his arms told a story of their own. He didn't need to answer the question, but he did, his words heavy with command. "Her husband. Commander of SEAL Team 4. The laughter stopped. The soldiers exchanged glances. They had heard of SEALs. Legends whispered about missions no one else could survive, about men who could disappear into shadows and strike before a heartbeat passed. They hadn't expected one to walk through the door tonight, let alone for him to be the husband of the simple woman they had tied like prey. The leader tried to regain control. He raised his weapon, but his hands trembled. "You're outnumbered," he spat, his voice cracking. The commander's eyes narrowed. "Then you'd better bring more men." Before the soldier could respond, the commander moved. It wasn't wild, wasn't reckless, it was precision. A strike, a twist, a disarm. In less than a blink, one man's weapon clattered to the floor, his arm pinned. Another soldier lunged, but was met with a brutal efficiency that dropped him to his knees. The rest hesitated, the weight of fear pressing down heavier than any rope. The woman watched, not with fear, but with quiet relief. She had always known what her husband was capable of, but more than that, she knew the heart behind the steel. He wasn't fighting for glory, wasn't fighting for vengeance. He was fighting for her, for the life they built, for the promise he had made on the day he first held her hand, that no matter what storm came, he would stand between it and her. One by one, the soldiers realized their mistake. Their mocking words about Superman now tasted like ash in their mouths. This wasn't a comic book hero. This was flesh and blood, a man trained to end wars before they began. And he was here because they had touched what mattered most to him. The leader stumbled back, his bravado gone. "We didn't know." The commander cut him off with a stare sharp enough to silence any excuse. He untied his wife with steady hands, the gentleness in his touch a stark contrast to the storm they had just witnessed. She smiled faintly, whispering, "I knew you'd come." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his voice low but firm. "Always." The soldiers, now stripped of arrogance, stood trembling, awaiting their fate. The commander looked at them, his expression unreadable. He could have ended it there, but his strength was not only in combat. It was in discipline, in mercy. "Leave," he ordered, his tone like stone. "And remember what you saw here tonight. A simple woman tied with rope is never truly alone when her husband stands behind her." They fled into the night, broken of their pride. The house grew quiet again, the storm settled. He held her close, the rope fallen at their feet, a symbol of how easily the world underestimated her because she seemed ordinary. But she wasn't. She was his anchor, his reason, his strength. And in the darkness of that night, the soldiers' mocking words lived on as irony. They had asked if Superman was going to fly in. What they didn't understand was that sometimes, the man who saves isn't wearing a cape. Sometimes, he wears scars. Sometimes, he carries the weight of battles unseen. And sometimes, he walks through the door, calm and unshaken, and the world freezes not because he can fly, but because he's real. For her, he was more than a soldier. He was home. And for anyone who dared to harm her, he was the nightmare they never saw coming. Life has a way of testing the strength of love in the most brutal of moments, and that night in the small cottage became the ultimate proof that appearances deceive and underestimation can be deadly. For the soldiers who thought they had captured nothing more than a simple, helpless woman were about to discover that the quiet soul they mocked was bound not just to ropes but to the heart of a man who lived and breathed danger every day, a man forged in silence, discipline, and shadows, a man they would come to fear the moment he crossed the threshold. It began with laughter, crude remarks about her being fragile, about her needing a savior, one of them jeering, "What now, Superman gonna fly in?" And she, instead of begging, instead of crying, stood still, eyes lowered, her silence unnerving even though they couldn't name why, for she knew something they could not fathom, that the man who had sworn to protect her, her husband, her anchor, was already on his way, and unlike the comic book hero they mocked, he was flesh, blood, and fury wrapped in calm precision, a SEAL commander whose name in certain corners of the world was spoken only in whispers. And as the soldiers closed in tighter, the sound of footsteps broke the rhythm of their arrogance, slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of authority no uniform could match, until a shadow filled the doorway, tall, broad, his stance unshaken, and silence fell heavy like a curtain cutting off their laughter. He did not shout, he did not need to, his voice, low and controlled, cut sharper than a blade when he said, "Let her go," and though the leader sneered at first, trying to cover his fear with bravado, asking mockingly who he thought he was, the reply was simple, devastating in its truth, "Her husband. Commander, SEAL Team 4, and in that instant their mocking turned to disbelief, their disbelief to dread, because every soldier there had heard of men like him, legends written not in books but in scars and silence, and before they could steady their shaking hands, he moved, not wild like a desperate man but precise like a master of storms, a twist here, a strike there, one weapon clattering to the floor, one man dropped to his knees, another disarmed before he even understood how, the room transforming into a battlefield where only he dictated the outcome, and she, bound but unbroken, watched with the calm of someone who trusted beyond fear, for she had seen not just his strength in war but his gentleness in peace, his promise to stand between her and every storm. And the soldiers, who had come so sure of their numbers, realized in horror that numbers meant nothing against the kind of man who had faced death and returned to tell its story, their leader faltering, stammering, "You're outnumbered," his weapon trembling, to which the commander's answer was steel itself, "Then you'd better bring more men," and in those words the truth hit them. This was not a man to be trifled with, this was not a Superman they could joke about, this was worse, this was real, and reality, unlike fiction, didn't forgive, didn't grant second chances, and as the commander untied his wife with hands steady and tender, she whispered, "I knew you'd come," to which he answered with the quiet finality of love itself, always, and it was then the soldiers understood they had never been facing a victim but had trespassed into the heart of a bond stronger than rope, stronger than fear.